Yeah.
Okay, good morning, Martin.
Morning or
Uh,
afternoon.
Afternoon for you. Great to be here, and thank you so much for joining me for the Clarity Conversation. Um, so let me begin by introducing for our audience a little bit about how we know each other. And you and I worked together at an incredible company called Quest about 20 years ago, and I had the incredible pleasure of being in one of your creative workshops where we created sculptures. And I remember we created sculptures, we weren't allowed to talk. So nobody could talk. We had to communicate without speaking, and we each had to create these sculptures. Um, and just to give the audience a tiny bit about your background is that you started in marketing at fragrance companies, and eventually you spun off by yourself because you've always had this incredible creativity and this fascination with how creativity lives or struggles to live in corporate America, right? And I think you and I were just talking a minute ago about like credentials and impressive resumes. And I think what I've always really appreciated and loved about you is that you just lead with your energy, and it doesn't matter so much. I'm sure you've got plenty of impressive things on your resume, and yet somehow that never matters in the moment. So I hope that's a fair introduction.
That's all right. Yeah.
Good. And then let me start with what I said we would start with, which was just a tiny bit of context of when I was growing up, I was a little bit surrounded by creatives. My mother was in the museum world. My sister went to art school. And I always thought I wasn't creative because I didn't have a lot of visual creativity. But in my work as a coach, there was a time several years ago when it finally hit me as I was following my client and listening and observing and synthesizing things that I could see happening with them and pulling what tools do I think could help, that I realized that I was in my own wildly creative process. And I also began to observe in my clients that when they relax and when they are at their best, not the kind of best we show on Facebook, but truly their relaxed inner wisdom, they can be wildly creative, even if it's a boring spreadsheet, even if it's a strategic plan. So I guess my question is for you to talk a little bit about your experiences in corporate life and working with corporate people as a creative, I'm going to say guru. All right, I've spoken too much. Off you go.
Off I go. Right. Come on, where to start? Well, I think a lot of it is without. I mean, we mentioned that we were talking earlier about this word spirituality. Sometimes it's misleading as a word because it sparks people off in ways they don't like. But actually, underneath it is it's a search for genuine identity and generally a sense of personal liberation. Because I found within corporate life that there are so many masks being put up and you can't express vulnerability, etc., etc. And then actually people are becoming quite dysfunctional in the way that they operate. So for instance, I remember in New York working with the Fine Fragrance Group at Quest, or Givaudan as it became. And one of their very top perfumers, we did a painting session with her, and she absolutely loved it. We're using a life model, and which is unusual for corporate America, apparently. But yeah, we were painting, and she absolutely loved it. I had to drag her away in the coffee break because she just wanted to carry on. And we got chatting. I said, well, where do you find room to nourish? Because you're putting all this energy out, and everyone wants a piece of it because she's so successful. So salespeople wanted her, valuation wanted her, clients wanted her, and so she was working like crazy, putting all this energy out. But I said, well, how do you nourish? And she said, well, I just don't get time for that. And it was so sad because you realize that, I get the impression in New York society generally, everyone's living so fast paced. So, you know, if you go to yoga, you power walk to yoga and you do your thing in your space, and then you move on. And what I've found is just giving people a safe space to work in, to ground, and to just be, to use an expression, to live dynamically in the present, even if it's just for a day, can be very enriching and very re-empowering. So that's what I started doing, just realizing that you know, there's a dysfunction in the speed that people live their lives at, and the kind of dysfunction that comes from that kind of lifestyle. So we started to do things where, in a way, it's like creating a place where magical things happen. And it's not about me, it's about, all I'm doing is just setting a safe space for people to flourish, because they will. But part of that is actually respecting the fact that we are all vulnerable, actually. And one of the things, do you know Brené Brown, the one wonderful author and speaker? One of the things she talks about is vulnerability, that almost goes right across the way that corporate life has become. You know, because you can't express any vulnerability, but we're all vulnerable. We all have weaknesses. Many of us are living lives of quiet desperation. You know, look at parents with young kids. You know, they're treading water to cope, etc., etc. So, in a way, work can serve your life. It doesn't have to be that you separate work and your real life, and work is this and life is that. It's actually creating work that serves better one's life in a holistic way.
Yeah.
So that's in a snapshot some of the work I've been doing.
Yeah, it reminds me of, now I'm going to get very very heady here, but well, there's two things I think of. Is one is that this invulnerability and the mask and the posturing that we do in corporate life, it's almost like water for the fish. It's so present that we don't even see it. And I think what your workshops do, somebody's drilling outside my house. What your workshops do remind me of Plato's cave myth. You know, when someone just goes to tap the dark prisoners on the shoulder and say, just turn around, and there can be this incredible moment where you realize that somebody's waking up in my house, where you realize that that it is around you, and that you have to work to wake up from it, you know?
Yes, you do.
You were talking a minute ago, we were discussing the power of now. And I remember also reading that book and just the incredible realization of what is in every moment almost can bloom.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah, here it is. Because although it's a book for, you know, everyone, it has high relevance to business people. And I use a lot of the thought processes within the book and within his teaching. I use quite a lot, because we were talking earlier, you know, when he was sat on a park bench, because he had a mental, Eckhart Tolle had a mental breakdown effectively. And when he was recovering and when he was reconfiguring the way he thought, which became the book, you know, he was sat on a park bench in New York, just watching people go by. And he saw these women power walking to the yoga studio, and they don't see anything else. And they go there and they do their yoga and they go to work, and there's no connection. There's no nourishment. There's no nourishment, because you don't have time for it, ironically. And I remember I started a workshop in a hotel once, and I think there were about, I don't know, 30 people in the room. And I asked them, I said, okay, when you came in the hotel, did you notice anything about what was on the walls, you know, any of the nice things? And there were three things. They could only mention three things, 30 people. Because they come in, they park the car, they're in a rush, straight into the room. They hadn't spent any time looking. So in a way, some of the techniques we use are simply to slow people down, but also to see. So I collaborate quite a lot with a fantastic artist called Peter Feroz, and he's trained at the Royal Academy, and he's a bit of a maverick, but a creative genius. And we often work together, and we develop processes that basically get people to sit down and to paint and to draw, because drawing is about seeing. So if, for instance, you have a life model and you have to draw the life model, and you're asked to use 3 lines only, then you're naturally deconstructing and you're prioritizing. And these sorts of thought processes are really powerful for applying to whatever the industry might be. So the other thing I've used is music as well. If you have to create a piece of music, or a film for that matter, and you have to edit film, so you send people out with cameras and say, right, okay, go and ask people about well-being. So they all go out their mobile phones, they interview people, you come back, you put all the footage onto the computer, and you end up with 2 hours worth of film footage. And you say, right, I want a 3-minute film. And so you have to naturally select a narrative story. What's the story you want to tell? How do you deconstruct it? How do you tell it with the most power? How do you create the best aesthetics, etc., etc.? These are all deep creative processes, which quite often, I mean, certainly marketing people are often asked to do without actually even thinking about it, and certainly not collaborating together to do it. So often the workshops are really about finding metaphors, usually artistic metaphors, and then saying, okay, well, from that, how can we bridge this across to the real world? So, for instance, do you know the company Joe Malone? Have you heard of Joe Malone, the fragrance company? We worked with them for a long while, actually, it was a whole creative process where we were looking at, for instance, when you went into a Joe Malone store, what was the journey? What was the story that you were getting when you walked into a store? So we ran a number of workshops, and one of the themes that came up was the interaction between structure and flow. So the structure of a store and the flow of the journey. So for instance, if you walk into a store and there's a big desk in front of you based on a concierge idea from a hotel, what does that do to your energy when you walk into the store?
Yes.
And it's actually very disruptive. So you think actually having a concierge is a really good thing, but in energetic terms, it's having a real problem here, because there's this big desk in front of you. And so working with them, we started to develop a whole series on flow and structure that their designers and their architects found so interesting. One of the killer metaphors was we brought a ballerina in, and I briefed her to dance three small dances on flow. And she did these beautiful dances and then talked about what she was doing. And there were so many points that came from it, but she'd taken 20 years of her life to develop the body and the strength and to be able to flow in such a beautiful way.
Yeah.
And these kind of metaphors are incredibly enriching, and as long as they can be bridged across, because the worst thing you can do is just go on an away day and leave it there, and it has no relevance, because then people say, well, actually, I much prefer to be doing the real work, which is the stuff I do, usually, and going away is too expensive for me personally.
Yeah. This is right. That's always the challenge, is that those forces, that water around the fish is so powerful in corporate life, or in New York life, or in our busy lives, in actually our overinformed lives right now, that it's so hard to peel it back and to escape or to maintain it,
But I think we live in an overstimulated world. I mean, when I was in New York is not alone in this. London is probably the same, but I was saying earlier, last time I was in New York, I was having dinner with some New Yorkers, and I sat back like I was from a foreign world, another planet, because these guys had all they were living like 10 times my life in terms of speed. And, you know, if they wanted the latest kind of yoga hybrid, it was there. If they wanted the latest food stuff, it was there, you know, and none of them could sustain relationships because they have one relationship and then another relationship. And I looked at them and thought, wow, they're almost completely different human beings to me. Now, I'm not, okay, maybe I'm sounding judgmental, but somewhere in the mix, there has to be a time just to give oneself space, give oneself time, allow personal ritual, meditation, the power of meditation, just to create space.
And also to be enough as you are, and to be okay with being a flawed human being.
Yeah.
And to trust that there's something wonderful in you that, if you can share it with flaw, you do create more intimacy and connection. Yeah, I think that is so important. And I do think New York is a place where people are so driven that they lose relationship, whether it's romantic, whether it's friendship, whether it's community. You know, we struggle, and there's a lot of competitive feeling about relationship in New York.
Yeah, because friends become rivals. You know, for if you're aspiring, if you're on that treadmill to get on and to become somebody that you know you want to be and you're not now, and all that kind of stuff, then it's a terrible treadmill to be on.
Right. They can become rivals, and they can also become tools. Right.
Yeah.
The relationships can be very transactional.
Yes.
When vulnerability is absent.
And yet, ironically, within everyone, there's a desire for genuine connection.
Yes.
And that the irony is that people want it, but their lifestyle is anything but producing those sorts of genuine connection points with people where you can sit and be known by somebody. And I suppose it boils down to, I remember asking a bunch of financial people. I was doing an away day workshop for 45 people who sold financial products, GMAC. You might remember them, General Motors. And I can remember I said to them, do you think good management might be about love? and it honestly, it was like I'd sworn. I cussed, to use an American word. And it was so funny. And we all fell about laughing because they realized, and I said, okay, if you can't use the L word, what's the word that you feel comfortable using? And they said, well, I guess we could care about each other.
Yeah.
And that's as far as they go, because they can't use that, because they were being judged on the amount of money they were making. Their bonuses were all dependent on it. Same in perfumery. You know, if one perfumer wins, it means 3 other perfumers lose.
Yeah.
And so the relationships, like you say, become very transactional. And I used to deal with perfumers because of essentially their loneliness.
Yeah.
And because it's a very lonely place. And if you're not successful in terms of winning fragrances, then you get thrown out. It's as simple as that. So
it's interesting.
It's very dehumanizing.
Yeah, it's dehumanizing. I mean, competition and comparison becomes, in some way, it's a driver of performance, but it also is, you know, like junk food. It's not nourishing. It's not a nourishing driver of performance.
I think you also have to decide what is identity, you know, and what drives identity. Because for a lot of people, it might be a big car, it might be personalized number plates, it could be, you know, the house they have or whatever, or the job they have, you know, so they're important and everyone looks up to them. Those things really, for me, become an irrelevance. That's not who I am. And even what I think doesn't define who I am, because what I think is not actually reality.
Yeah.
They're just constructs. That Eckhart Tolle again talks about thought constructs, that opinions that we have. They're just opinions. They're not who we are. So particularly opinions about yourself, because we were talking about limiting beliefs. We all have limiting beliefs that come from the church, the family we grew up in, the school we went to, etc., etc., and they're with us. So, but they're not who we are.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, I mean, like the first thing I love within workshop environments is people say, oh, I can't draw, you know,
Yeah.
they're successful business people, I can't draw. And then you encourage them to draw, and they realize actually they can communicate using, and some of them do incredible work, but the paradigm is they can't draw because they've lost that ability to be spontaneous and to play. You know, play is a very
Yes.
powerful thing.
Yes. So here's, as you're talking, there's something, because I also know that we could talk for hours. We always do. But I'm thinking about like the team, you know, the corporate team. And I often think of a lot of teams as a pomegranate, you know, it's like the outer skin has dried up, and they're asking me, you know, how do we stop turnover? How do we keep our best people? How do we stop our managers from, or help them motivate the team? And there's this sort of feeling sometimes like, we don't have the best people. Let's get rid of these people and bring more. And I say, no, the problem is it's a pomegranate, and what you need to open it up, because there's
Absolutely.
so much fruit.
Absolutely.
And the very people that you have there, once you become vulnerable, once you let down the walls, once you stop the competition and collaborate, the creativity is wild in there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I was working with a team once, and they were in danger. They were the way it works in big business now is multinationals will have what they call core suppliers. I mean, this will be familiar to your audience, I'm sure. So that rather than have 20 suppliers, they'll go down to 3.
Yeah.
So if you're one of the 3, that's fine, but you have to play a lot of rules, you know, etc., etc. And I was asked to work with a team of people who were in danger of being thrown off the core supplier list of one of the clients they were working with. And so we started working with them on a process that you may have heard of called Blue River. It was a long process that was really to work with the people. The same people who were failing became incredible. Yeah. Literally within a year. And it wasn't down to me teaching them or anything like that. It was just allowing them to bring their gold. Because one of the things in meetings that is often neglected, the quietest person in the corner has as much gold to bring as anyone else.
Yes.
They won't bring you the gold unless they're listened to, they're acknowledged, and they're included. So one of the things I do in facilitating meetings is to try and care for people, genuinely care, because I'm not really interested in making money at all. I'm much more interested in people's potential, and it really excites me when, you know, going back to this team, the team leader at the time, we made a film of the exploits that we did with this team. We took them to the ice hotel in the Arctic, for instance, to understand freshness, and they did amazing paintings which were actually unveiled in London at an art gallery, and the press came, and suddenly everyone was writing about this incredible story that was going on. And a filmmaker who knew the team leader from of old, he said to me when I was video editing with him, he said, "What have you done to this guy?" I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we interviewed him 3 years ago where he was actually really boring and very dull. And now he's full of life and vitality, and he's got stories. And you can imagine when he goes and sees his clients now, he's a changed person because of his identity in some ways have changed, the value systems that he's got. So it's energizing the stories that people tell rather than, you know, work being boring. I have to do it to earn money for, you know, blah, blah. That work becomes this sort of incredibly powerful part of your life. And also and it's full of...
sorry, I have to jump in, but what you just described to me is that he learned to trust that who he really was, who he imagined was boring, was actually so much more interesting than the mask and the projection that he was creating to the outside world.
Well, it's interesting.
That takes a lot of trust and self-esteem.
Well, it's interesting as a postscript. What they then found was that the customer who was threatening to throw them off the core supplier list for being boring and dull, that acknowledging they were good technically, but actually they were boring. Within 2 years, they said that the company now was probably the most creative company they dealt with, and they were asking for creative consultancy advice
Yes.
for their own business processes. So, you know, okay, sometimes you've got to play the game. You've got to look at the bottom line. You can say, well, actually, as a result of that investment, which is actually quite small, you know, this huge benefit was accrued, but that's by the by as far as I'm concerned. I'm much more interested in the human stories that come out of it.
It's the small investment with a lot of faith and trust.
Yeah.
That's it. So
well, it also does take a degree of courage from a team leader. So, for instance, what I've done is we'll go to team leader. We'll say, look, this is what we do. This is what you could get out of it, and it takes complete buy-in. And that particular team, I remember the conversation. 2 team leaders, and they said, you know what, we don't quite get where this thing can take us, but we're prepared to give it 100%. And once you've got that, once you've got people to step into the balloon, you know, and you've got takeoff. But the worst thing in this kind of work is, you know, not having that kind of buy-in.
Right. We want to know what the end is going to be before we begin.
Yeah, and I never know where the end's going to be. Sometimes I have to say no, because another team leader came to me and he said, well, we've got problems with our team and we'd like to rebrand it. I said, yeah, fine. What do you want to do? He said, well, I can give you half a day. and I said, you know, sorry, that's just not the way it works. Yeah. It could be half a day, but it could be 6 months. You never know, because as Steve, I think it was Stephen Covey, you know, the great business guru, he said, working with people is not like moving the furniture.
Yeah.
You know, it's not. People are not like that. Quite often, the people who are the most cynical at first become the most zealous in time, as you get that human dynamic and that chemistry and that synergy going, I suppose.
Yeah,
it's exciting though.
All right, so let's stop here because I realize we could go on all day. And, so thank you so much, Martin. And I have to say, not so much as a plug, but if people wanted to get in touch with you, do you have a website? Where would they look?
Funny you should say that, because I have a website, but I never published it because I could never actually decide. I was never comfortable with it because what I do is so weird and wonderful. So sure, I'm more than happy to talk to people, but probably do it via email. If you want to give them the email, that's fine. Or
they can actually, they can write to me, or they can also find you on LinkedIn.
Yes, you can find some of my recent ramblings on LinkedIn, yeah.
Good. So it's, just to let them know, it's Martin Holme, Holme.
That's it.
All right. Thank you so much. And I look forward to speaking to you soon.
Okay. Lovely to see you, and wish you well.
I'm going to stop recording.
Okay. Thanks.